ColdFusion Alive, the podcast for the ColdFusion community. Discover practices, tools, techniques, tips, trends, and what's new in the world of ColdFusion today. Brought to you by TerraTech, the ColdFusion experts.
Welcome back to the show. I'm here with Miles Rausch, and that name is somewhat Germanic or Luxembourgian, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But Miles is talking at CF Objective on progressive web app building, and he's doing it using Lucee CFML and ColdBox and a bit of command box, and we'll talk about that in the episode. But we'll look at what a progressive web app is and why you want to be doing that with your apps, and why you shouldn't be trusting your client's network connection to be always on. And who's leading the charge in this progressive web app movement, and who's a bit left behind, and how it relates to the offline first, I know you said online there, it's offline first movement that Google has championed over the years. So welcome, Miles.
Thank you, Michael. Thanks for having me.
So I think the question here for people who haven't created a progressive web app is what on earth is a progressive web app, and have they ever used one without knowing it?
Well, if you are a fan or a user of Google products, chances are you've come across at least one or more of their progressive web apps. What a progressive web app loosely is a set of web technologies designed to give users more of a native application experience. We got this promise when the iPhone came out from Steve Jobs, who said that they wouldn't need an app store because your websites would be your apps. And Apple kind of failed to deliver on that promise at that moment, but now others, and especially Google, have taken up the mantle of how do we give users the experience that they've really come to expect and enjoy using native apps, but do it in an open way by getting developers, browser manufacturers, and standards bodies to kind of agree on some technologies that can be created out in the open to deliver on those promises. So it kind of combines things like caching, an offline first experience that caches content for you, the ability to do this all in the background of the browser so that the user interface of your website is free to do what it needs to without being blocked by this background work. And then sort of also offering things like a add to home screen or an install banner or those other kind of features that really have become standard in native apps, but doing it from the web instead.
This podcast is brought to you by TerraTech, the ColdFusion experts. If you have a ColdFusion app that you don't have time to maintain, TerraTech's ColdFusion Revive service is the answer. And now back to our podcast.
So everyone here probably has used Google Docs or other apps, and maybe they've even taken that risk of editing a Google Doc when they're not online. I know the first time I did that when I was on a plane flight, I kind of had my fingers crossed that it wasn't going to lose all the thousands of words I was typing. But they do seem to work pretty good. So what you're saying is if we have apps we're creating, we can make those progressive as well.
Yeah, and the key to progressive web apps is that they enhance an existing website. It's not changing the way you make websites now. It's adding a new layer of functionality on top of it that progresses it into more of an app experience. And in that sense, it makes it really easy to take even just a simple marketing website and give it what we feel of as these fancy features of being offline enabled and having all that stuff offline cached and giving it these load patterns when people install it to their home screen and those kind of things. But yeah, I mean, the Google's been working in this realm for a very long time, and now the APIs are getting to where even I would say even a beginner who has some experience with front-end development can get their site offline enabled pretty quickly. And that's what I hope to show in my talk too with the demo I do at the end, is taking a simple website built with ColdBox and Lucee and running on command box on my machine and showing how I can enhance that using these technologies.
That sounds really valuable to do. But if someone was trying to justify this to their manager, you know, why the heck should I make this app progressive? What could they say to them?
Well, I think managers like to see case studies. You know, they like to see it proven in the industry. And in my talk, I do sort of briefly touch on two really compelling stories. And one is Forbes. And they have a YouTube video out there that they produced that talks about the sort of improvements they got. And I don't remember the numbers offhand, but they increased user engagement, the amount of time users spent on their site, and the number of times people return to the site. Because if you cache everything that you're presenting to your user, everything will load faster. That's just the nature of, you know, networking and download and bandwidth and all those other things we've come to contend with on the network. And so you see a better user engagement because, as we know, the longer a user has to wait for content on your site, the more chances it gives them to second guess coming to your site at all versus a competitor. And so by adopting these techniques, you make a faster website just by the nature of how these technologies work. And then that ends up converting into a better user experience. The other case study, which is really interesting, and a lot's been written about this online, is Twitter's recent relaunch of what they call Twitter Light. And they redid the sort of mobile experience of Twitter as a progressive web app. And they've been seeing a lot of increased user engagement and usage, increased load speeds, and for Twitter, you know, they haven't always had a great user experience. Back in the fail whale days, back now, you know, 10 years ago, to take their mobile experience and make it a progressive web app, they've seen astounding results with that too. So, you know, I would say not only should a good indicator be the companies that are backing this, like Google, who they do a lot of experimentation, but they don't put this many of their developers, these many resources behind something trivially. You know, they use data to back up these moves that they make. But then also these individual case studies of two really high profile companies that have had really great results with progressive web apps.
So we'll put the links to those in the show notes for that YouTube video and any other case studies we can find there so people can reference them.
Google has, Google does have a progressive web app showcase sort of mini site that they did that has more than just those two examples. So I can give you the link to that whole gallery, and that'll give people a lot of examples to look at.
Fabulous. Well, we'll put that in the show notes along with all the other things we mentioned in the show. So I guess one of the questions here is, you know, I think developers traditionally assume that their users are going to have internet connectivity the whole time. So why shouldn't you trust your users' internet connectivity 100% of the time?
Well, I think there's there are kind of two ways to look at the benefits to the offline first story. You know, one is that a lot of companies, international companies in particular, are seeing these emerging markets. You know, a lot of these companies, if they're based in the US, they look at emerging markets in China and India and Africa, and they see that these are people who have grown up with this kind of technology, but usually in the form of feature phones rather than smartphones, and in the form of really spotty networks, not, you know, LTE or, you know, 4G networks like tend to have in more industrialized countries. So by adopting these technologies, you can give those users a really premium experience at a relatively low cost because they're starting to get cheaper versions of smartphones with the same technology that expensive smartphones have. And by making your site progressively enhanced, you can then sort of work around those network limitations that they have over there. And then you bring those people onto your platform because they have such a good experience. But it's was then, a relatively low investment for you to handle that sort of huge Achilles heel of a poor network. But say you're not international, say you focus in one country that does have really good internet connection, you still have moments where your customers will not be connected. So maybe they're on flights, like I think we've talked about before. You don't always have either any connection or really expensive and not great connectivity. These same technologies work for that use case as well. Either it's someone disconnecting when they usually have a good connection, or it's someone who rarely has a good connection. But either way, people don't have network all the time. Things happen, disasters happen, inconveniences happen. And if your app is just built in a way that assumes the network is optional, then you protect yourself against those would-be cases, and then you also give them a better experience anyway. So you kind of help solve for two issues.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. So having decided we're going to try out one of these progressive apps, who's leading the charge in the progressive app movement, and what companies are kind of left behind on that?
So I've mentioned them a couple times, but Google has really been at the forefront of this. They have a unique position in that they are a creator of web apps and websites, and they're also a creator of a web browser. And so they can sort of work this problem from both angles. They can get developers on board and easily connect them to, the Chrome and then even the Android teams on the browser side, and figure out what makes sense for both of these two parties. And a lot of people who work at Google and Mozilla and Microsoft are taking part in these standards groups to really nail down what these APIs look like, so that everyone's in agreement with how they should work, and thinking through the edge cases and the potential fallbacks, but then also the benefits. And then Google's been all in on supporting that on their Android phones, the Android browsers, and the Chrome browser, across all those platforms that they're launched on. Microsoft is another company that's doing a lot of good work in this. Windows 10 has some good support for progressive web apps built even into their Windows Store, where you can develop an app for the store that's based on web technologies. And they've been sort of ensuring that those apps then get the progressive web app features that go into the store that they can expect in the browser. Unfortunately, kind of quiet on this front is the Apple browser team. Safari and mobile Safari they've been kind of lagging behind. They don't support nearly as many features as the Android handsets do, and you have to kind of. It's nice that you can progressively enhance this stuff, so you're not making a broken app if your users use those technologies, but it would be nice to have them be more a part of this whole journey than they seem to be. But.
And how about Adobe and Lucee?
In terms of progressive web storing?
Yeah, well, in terms of supporting creating progressive web apps.
Well, in terms of the role that Lucee would play, progressive web apps are really a client-side enhancement. And so by definition, then they work perfectly with any sort of server language you choose to use, because they enhance on top of that. So I'm not aware of anything specifically that Lucee would play as a role in this, but I'm I'm certain that the members of the organization would be in favor of this kind of thing. And there's a lot of things built into Lucee that, you know, make it easy to sort of, you know, to make these AJAX calls to sort of synchronize your data when you need to, when you're back online, you know, being able to expose the CFC using the remote methods. It's an extremely handy functionality to kind of use that without any extra setup to, you know, apply a sort of synchronization event into your app. You know, I think Adobe, I wouldn't be surprised if they are, you know, seeing the light and playing into this role too. You know, they don't make a browser per se. A lot of the things they produce, like Photoshop, are native applications rather than web applications, but they do still have a suite of web tools for producing things. And I can't speak to them specifically, but I would hope that they're, you know, looking at or even playing an active role in providing tools for developers, front end and back end, to support progressive web apps.
And then I think I heard you say Firefox browser supports this as well.
Yes, and the Mozilla team, you know, they have, I've seen representatives from there on these standards bodies talking about these features. So, you know, Mozilla and Chrome are sort of step in step with supporting these things and with the importance that they bring, and especially with Mozilla and, you know, their sort of outreach mission. You know, I think they're very compelled by the story of people in areas where there's not a good, consistent network, and making that experience better and more open. And so they're very much a part of this as well.
And then, you know, I know there was a offline first movement. How does that relate to this?
So the offline first movement is a bit older than the progressive web app movement, and in many ways was kind of the ancestor of it. From what I've seen as I've been following the offline first movement, is that it really sort of inspired and kind of became progressive web apps. You know, offline is one aspect of what we call progressive web apps, and that story's been there for a long time. And then the progressive web apps have ironically enough, progressively enhanced that story of offline first to add things like loading screens, install banners, add to home screen functionality, and some of these, and web push notifications too is another big API, adding that to the progressive web app suite of technologies.
So it all kind of comes together with progressive web apps, and it sounds like, how many years has this whole movement been going now?
Oh, that's a good question. You know, I think I remember first experiencing a sort of Google product that attempted something like this. You know, I think it's been years and years ago, you know, 5, maybe 10 years back, that Google has been trying to double down on web applications and making that their sort of primary way of reaching customers. The sort of offline first movement, I first started to notice maybe 4 or 5 years ago as a thing that was really sort of making progress and making noise. And then progressive web apps have been, as a term, used newer than that, maybe 2 or 3. And maybe it's just that when I noticed it, it had already been around for a little bit. But, you know, we've really been seeing the majority of this movement in the past 5 years, and especially in the last year or two, it seems to have really caught fire and really picked up speed, and then gotten, you know, people interested from all different kinds of companies that have all different kinds of customers.
Well, it sounds like in internet years, that's a pretty mature technology, and exciting to get involved in it now. I did have one concern. If I create a progressive web app, what happens if the client's device, you know, whether it's a laptop-based browser or it's a phone, what happens if their device crashes while they've made a whole bunch of edits and they're offline?
So, a lot of the progressive web app technology leaves the individual details of implementing it up to what the developer's use case is. But in general, you're working with what's called a service worker, and that's a special JavaScript file that runs in the background of the page that's being manipulated or called up by the user. And that script then responds to events that get sent to it. And it might be an install event, which is the first time a user goes to a page with that service worker. It might be a fetch event, which is when the network is asking for a file. The service worker kind of gets the ability to decide how it should handle that fetch event. And then you have a technique for communicating with the sort of more UI manipulating JavaScript by sending events or sending messages back and forth, which is a sort of technology, an event technology that's been around for a while, but it's a way of passing messages from the front-end website to the service worker, which is working in the background. And so as long as that event has completed, if the browser crashes, everything is just left in the state that it's in, because everything's just reacting to events. There's no real request context per se as the page is up. It's just, perhaps if the browser crashes during the service worker acting on an event, you could have data loss there if it hadn't completed yet. But by and large, these things are all asynchronous, and background workers being in their own thread can then work very efficiently and very quickly. And so unless there's a bug in your code causing that crash at that moment, you should be in a pretty good place, But of course, that all comes down to if the developer is developing good code and is making those assurances. But yeah, I think the asynchronous nature, the background working of the service worker, these were all decisions they made in developing these APIs, and they made them for a reason, and it helps afford certain sort of comforts to the developer that help recover from those kind of situations much more easily than what older technologies would have afforded.
So there's several layers here. There's the user interface in the browser, which may be implemented in JavaScript using some library. And then it sends requests to this service worker layer that writes the data either to a local data store on the client's side, or it's sending it off over the internet to the server. And then obviously on the server, you've probably got several other layers where you've possibly got ColdFusion code and then a database layer that's eventually saving it in a database.
Yeah. So and that's part of the power of service workers, is that what is doing the sort of heavy work for you is set apart from what's doing the user interface work for you. And so that affords you then this ability to write code that will, cache it locally in the client, either using something like IndexedDB or local storage or some other technology, or it can send it off to the network if it detects, hey, I can actually get to my server. That's when you can do a sort of synchronization step. And you can do both. You can cache it in the background and then call a different function that periodically will check to see, hey, do I have network connection? If so, let's cache the stuff and send it to the server. And then when all the work is done, you can send a message back to the UI saying, hey, tell the user that I took care of their job for them. And then the user can interact with it from that point. But it's then all sort of decoupled, and because of these layers, then you like I keep saying, you get to progressively enhance your website. If someone doesn't have any of these technologies in their browser, your website still works because you still have that website you started with. It's just these progressively enhance it another layer on top.
So those who've used Google Docs, there's a little thing where it says all changes saved in Drive or all changes saved offline. And there's a time period when you're typing furiously where it may actually be, it's kind of still saving the stuff. But the UI can tell you where what's been done with the data you've entered.
Yeah, and that is this sort of message passing back and forth. The UI can sort of queue messages to the service worker, and the service worker, even if it's doing a ton of work on those things, getting them ready to go to a server, that won't interrupt your flow. So you can type furiously and you shouldn't see a lag because the service worker is working. It'll just do what it needs to in the back.
And the service worker's on the client, so it's either in JavaScript or some other client-side layer.
Yep, it's a JavaScript file. So it's written in whatever sort of variant of JavaScript your browser supports, and it's the service worker files can be pretty simple. There's a couple core events that you sort of need to act on in order to get your service worker up and running, but a service worker can be really simply put together just by waiting to install, waiting to activate, and waiting to fetch. Those are kind of the three core events that you need.
So in your talk at CF Objective, you're going to show some code using Lucee CFML and ColdBox, and maybe using a bit of clever stuff in Command Box. Tell us a bit about how you implemented this using those technologies.
So I like in my talks to do a sort of live demo after I get through all the terminology and explanation, and hopefully convincing people of why this is something worthwhile to take a look at. And so I put together, we use Command Box as our sort of lifeline here at work for working locally on our CFML websites. So I used Command Box to start a new ColdBox website, just made it a pretty simple sort of marketing website with a couple of views and a couple handlers. And then that's the start of the site that I'm going to use for the demo. And then I have the project all in GitHub, in Git, and I have different branches that sort of step through different enhancements that I've made along the way. And so you can see the sort of early first step of adding a service worker, and then I'll sort of explain what the code means and how it puts together, and do some experimentation with how you can use Chrome's dev tools to really nicely sort of inspect and debug your service worker, and then even emulate an entirely offline experience with the check of a box. And then I do two more versions of that where I just keep adding features and showing sort of pitfalls maybe we've run into and how we enhance around that. So it's so as long as I get my slide deck to also be offline enabled, then I'll definitely be ready for the demo parts and the slide part as well, if the Wi-Fi isn't as good as it could be.
And your slide deck is in Google Presentations, or?
I use a web app called slides.com, and they have a way where you can, your presentation is built on web technologies, and they have a way for you to download it. And so that's usually what I've ended up doing in the past, is just to have the local copy so that I can run it in my browser and not have to worry about spotty Wi-Fi.
So you're going to be brave in this demo and actually pull the plug on the internet connectivity during the demo.
Yeah, I'll show. Now people will have to believe me a little bit because I'll be running the Command Box server locally as well, but I'll show them how Chrome DevTools has a box called offline, and that will basically simulates being offline by telling Chrome, hey, in this tab you can't load anything from the network. And so you can actually see how things don't download from the network, how you get broken images and stuff like that, unless you got your site set up to be offline enabled.
Cool. And why did you pick ColdBox to do this in? Does it help out with creating this kind of app, or?
With progressive web apps, since they enhance on top of whatever server language you have, no one CFML framework is better suited than another. but I use ColdBox. I've used it for some sites here at work. I really like the way it works, and the Ortus Solutions team does a good job with it. So it was really easy for me to just use CommandBox to install the framework in the site, and really easy to get the views I needed and the handlers. And so I, because I was interested in whatever I needed to do to get my presentation ready, that I didn't want to spend too much time on this demo website, so that I could concentrate on the content and the presentation itself. And so CommandBox made that really easy to get up and running, and hopefully then that's a story that appeals to the CFML developers, because they can say, hey, we have a CFML website for our client, and then it feels like, oh, I can see how he enhanced this as a progressive web app. That helps me visualize how I would enhance the website I'm working on as a progressive web app.
And what do you like about CommandBox? And just maybe tell people listening what the heck CommandBox is, in case they didn't know.
Sure. CommandBox is a sort of package manager and command line tool for Lucee and Adobe ColdFusion. It comes out of the Ortus Solutions team. I think Brad Wood is the primary developer, the lead developer on it. It basically gives you the power of CFML from your command line, from a really easy to install executable. It works great on all platforms. I use it personally on a Windows machine here at work, and on Mac is what I'll be using in my presentation. So it works perfectly in both. And especially anyone who's in, say, the Node community, there's NPM and Yarn as really great command line tools for those languages and technologies. And CommandBox, I think, took a note from how those worked, and makes it really easy to not only create these packages in CFML, so like reusable boxes of code that you could use in multiple projects if you wanted, but then also to just fire up CFML servers ad hoc whenever you need them, just from the command line, going to that folder and typing box start, and then you have a Lucee server or a Adobe ColdFusion server starting in that folder, ready to execute your CFML code for you.
And the really cool thing is you didn't have to download the latest version of that, Adobe ColdFusion. Say you wanted to test your code in CF9 or CF 2016 or Lucee 5 or whatever. You just tell it you want to run it in that version, and it deals with getting the latest version of it. So
it handles engine download, engine switching like a charm. I mean, and that's really key when you have maybe different versions of these engines that you're working with, and you want to see, well, does this site still work on CF9? Does this site still work on the latest Adobe CF? Or if you're working with Lucee and you want to see, hey, I wrote this for Lucee 4.5, but we want to switch to 5. Does the site still work? I mean, CommandBox makes it dead simple to switch engines just with a command line parameter. So yeah, it's a godsend. We use it all the time.
And in addition, when you said command line, you can run individual, commands if you need to, but you also can write whole scripts that run inside CommandBox. So instead of writing, what we used to do, batch files years ago, you can write stuff to automate things in ColdFusion code.
Yeah, not only can you just, this is turning a little bit into a CommandBox commercial, but it's a great tool.
Well, it's a free tool. It's open source. I think we're allowed to do, I don't mind. I don't mind telling people about cool software. I don't mind if it's paid or not. But in this case, it's free. Gee.
Yeah.
I think they deserve a little bit of love given back to spread the message that CommandBox is cool.
I mean, CommandBox is the tool. I've been doing some sort of CFML development now for, I think, about 10 years. And CommandBox is the tool that I wanted 10 years ago. And it's just, it makes the whole user experience of working with either Adobe ColdFusion or Lucee, just so refined. It makes it such a happier experience because you don't have to figure out where do I install these things. You know, especially if you're not used to working with JVM languages, there can be a whole sense of I have to get what Tomcat? What's Tomcat? And then I have to do this and put this where, and where do I put my files? That, you know, it can be so many steps just to get to writing the CFML code. But with command box, it's just a command in your terminal, and then you're up and running.
That is amazing. And I noticed that there's a progressive web app dev summit as well that Google puts on. Did you go to that or attend it online or?
No, I haven't. I think I've watched some of the videos, and I know they did a whole progressive web app tracked at Google I/O. But yeah, but part of choosing this talk, part of submitting this talk was I'd been watching progressive web app technologies for a while, but hadn't devoted the time to figuring out how it works and how it implement it. And I knew that if I submitted a talk on that, I would have to figure this stuff out in pretty quick time. And so it became a good motivator to really dig in and read every article I can find and watch videos and really sort of dig into the guts of how these technologies work and what features they're enabling developers to utilize. But have not yet had the opportunity to go to a conference or hear very many talks in person on the topic yet, but hopefully this coming year.
Right, but they are recorded, so you can go on the link that we'll put in the show notes and have a look at some of this stuff if you want to dive into it in more detail. So it is good stuff. So let's change gears a little bit now. And I know you and your company moved to use Lucee CFML a while back. So tell us a bit about that, Miles. Why you moved and how that move was.
So we first started exploring the idea of open source CFML about 5 years ago. And we were looking at how the performance we were getting out of some of our Adobe ColdFusion sites wasn't where we thought it should be. We were trying to figure out where the issues could be coming from. And since we were doing all this sort of, server tweaking and updating to try to narrow in on these issues, I'd been hearing a lot about open source CFML engines, and Rilo was the sort of front-end contender that we've been hearing about. Some of the other developers were hearing about those too when we kind of talked to our sort of server administrator, and we got a Rilo server sort of stood up and running, and we put some code on it, and we made a couple adjustments in order to get it to run, because at that day this was 5 years ago, so a lot's changed since then, but we had to make just a couple minor changes since the code bases were pretty old. But once we did and we compared it to performance, it was a sort of night and day difference. And it didn't take long to see the benefits of Rilo, being that it's built in the open, using open source, being that the group behind it was responsive and visible. You had people that you could reach out to, not just a sort of large company that you had to interact with. And then when Lucee sort of branched off from Rilo, we really quickly moved to that, and we really haven't looked back since. I mean, all our sites pretty much run on Lucee. All our local development's done on Lucee. We've contributed code to the Lucee project and to the documentation projects, and it's been a real night and day difference in how our sites perform and just our developer efficiency and performance.
And was moving the code between those versions of ColdFusion a lot of hard work, or did it pretty much run out of the box? Or
it all depended on the project. If you have older projects that were written in, say, CF5 days, or if you have really old code, the Rilo and Lucee code bases weren't necessarily written to go all the way back in Adobe ColdFusion's history. And so we'd find that our Adobe code was getting away with things that weren't good practice anymore and were frowned upon, that Rilo and Lucee was saying, no, that's not quite right. And so those older pieces we had to modernize to fit with Lucee, but none of the stuff that we had written the year we switched had any issue, because it was all using best practices. And so it was good code. It was a lot better code than what had been written before. And anything now that we write, anything new that we convert over is pain-free. It just comes across because it's all modern web application.
Cool. So let's have a look at why you're proud to use CFML.
I think a CFML, especially I'm a big proponent of open source and open development. Progressive web apps are built on that sort of backbone of being out in the open and hearing everyone's voice. And the open source CFML movement, and for us, Lucee in particular, brings the comforts of a language that's extremely easy to get up and running with, to sort of dig into for the first time, and it puts it on an engine that is open to anyone to help improve and contribute to. I think we really see open source languages as having taken over so much of the internet, because people want to have ownership. They want to be able to not only share in the sense of the commonwealth of humanity and improving everyone so that all boats rise higher, but then also they have an ownership on that product, and they feel like if there's a problem with it, there's a lot of people looking at it. Either a lot of people having it and then complaining about it through open source ticket systems, but then an equal number of people who have hopefully the capacity, but also the expertise to step in and fix that. And that's, I think, a true power of open source, is that it makes a better product over and over and over again. And CFML has a unique story, as I'll put it, in that it's a really easy language to get up and running with. And especially with something like CommandBox, it doesn't take much to actually start running CFML on a local laptop or desktop machine. And the syntax is really straightforward, especially if you work with tags. But even the script syntax, shares so much in common with the really popular C-based style languages that really anyone can pick up CFML, whether they're a developer or not, with just a little bit of training and maybe some guidance along the way. But I think that's really a compelling story these days. JavaScript is getting kind of more complicated and a little more nuanced, and that is setting it up, I think, to be a better language than it has been in the past, but could also set it up to be a taller bar to jump over in order to really get proficient in it. And CFML, I think, does a better job of being more friendly to people who don't have computer engineering degrees or computer science degrees.
Yeah, I think I'd agree with that. It's very easy to get into. On the other hand, it doesn't, if you want to do lots of deep computer science type clever stuff, like, progressive web apps or other object-oriented things, ColdFusion lets you do that. It's easy to get into and it's powerful. So,
yeah. Well, and with its unique ability to jump into the Java layer too, I mean, you can really then dig into extremely complicated computer sciencey stuff. It's almost like you pull up an escape hatch and you can get down into all this sort of gritty machinery to muck up around in and really develop something interesting and computer sciencey, if you want to put it that way.
So, you know, sometimes we read about threads saying ColdFusion is dying, but I've been reading those for over 10 years and it still seems alive. But what would it take to make ColdFusion even more alive this year, in your opinion?
I pin the hopes of CFML in general. I think there's a lot of promise, like I said, in the open source versions of it. And I really see that story as being necessary for the promotion of the language. Because I think while Adobe ColdFusion has its developer edition, and you can get to that through something like Command Box, I think that the open source Lucee CFML engine is really where new blood's going to come in, and where you're going to get new interests and new use cases for it. And I think it's a matter of sort of the people who have a vested interest in that doing what they can to promote it and to showcase that they utilize it in their projects. You know, there's not necessarily a lot of that, of saying just, hey, we built this cool thing and we built it using Lucee. And then that would get other people interested in, well, I like that cool website. Oh, and it's built using Lucee. I wonder what that is. And then being able to jump over to the association website, learn more about the language, and then hopefully see how easy it is to get working with it on their local machine and take it from there.
So maybe we need like a little competition for who's built sites in ColdFusion, and make a page that lists all the cool ones out there to encourage people to promote their site, and put that, you know, put a link to what the technology they used on their about page or something, to help get the word out on it. Those sound like some really cool things to do.
Yeah, that'd be interesting. A sort of showcase website of the, you know, best and brightest that CFML has produced.
And I really like, you know, looking at some of this progressive stuff that you're talking about. Google does a great job of having case studies, you know, about progressive apps, and maybe ColdFusion needs some case studies of, you know, things that have been done, not just listing the website, but going into the neat things that they were able to achieve using this technology and how they were able to do it better.
Well, and there's definitely no shortage of really intelligent people working in this community. It's just we don't seem to be doing a great job of talking about the things that we do and really showcasing the interesting and complex and fascinating things we're doing with the language. So yeah, I think there's a lot to be said for that.
Cool. So what are you looking forward to at CF Objective?
Well, what I look forward to every time I come to CF Objective is to learning something new. I like learning and growing. That's part of why I chose this topic to speak on, so that I would be forced to learn as much about it as possible. And so I'm looking forward to just whatever random thing that maybe I've never even heard of before, people come there to share and to really sort of expand my world of, you know, what I know about web technology and web development. So, and hanging out with the fun people that we hung out with last year. That's always a blast too.
And a chance to get out of North Dakota, where you are now, and visit Washington, D.C., and maybe see some of the historic monuments and other stuff that's in the nation's capital. Yeah,
that'll be nice too. It'll be, I'm sure, maybe a little hotter than it is in South Dakota right now, but it's definitely going to have a lot more people and things to see.
Cool. So if people wanted to find you online, what's the best ways to find you, Miles?
So I blog. I have a personal website, milesrausch.com. That's RAUSCH. My Twitter handle is at Awaken, Awayken. And you can probably find me on LinkedIn too. My name Miles Rausch is my LinkedIn, but I've been trying to blog more about web development topics, and so a couple of my recent posts are kind of along those lines. And I tweet here and there when a random thought jumps into my head that seems like the internet needs to hear, then I'll put that out on Twitter. So you can find me there.
Great. Well, thanks so much for being on the CF Alive podcast.
Thank you, Michael.
ColdFusion Alive. Thanks for subscribing on iTunes. Look for your next episode soon.